You want to understand the mechanics of the January 2026 pivot, but you need to stop thinking like a diplomat and start thinking like a refinery shift manager, because this is not a political realignment, it is a hostile takeover of the global material balance sheet, starting with the viscosity physics of the Orinoco Belt. When Washington executed Operation Absolute Resolve to extract the Maduro regime, they were not securing a government, they were securing the feed rate for the PIDD-3 refinery complex on the U.S. Gulf Coast, because American energy independence is a myth without heavy sour crude. The U.S. shale revolution produced light sweet crude with an API gravity of 40 to 50, which is essentially highly flammable champagne, but the complex refineries in Texas and Louisiana, specifically the cokers and hydrocrackers at plants like Motiva or Marathon Garyville, were engineered decades ago with a high Nelson complexity index to process heavy sludge with an API gravity of 8 to 10. For years, we have been blending premium shale oil just to simulate the chemical profile of the Venezuelan crude we sanctioned, destroying our crack spread margins and energy return on investment. So the seizure of Caracas is physically about securing the upgraders in the Jose Antonio Anzoátegui industrial complex that dilute that extra heavy tar-like bitumen so it can actually flow through a pipeline without needing to be heated to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. You have to understand that Venezuelan crude is high in sulfur and vanadium, metals that poison catalysts if you do not have the specific metallurgy to handle them, which the Chinese teapots do not have, but the U.S. Gulf Coast possesses in abundance, meaning this military operation was effectively a vertical integration strategy to marry the world's largest heavy oil reserves with the world's only processing capacity, capable of turning it into diesel and jet fuel efficiently. However, the operational reality on the ground is going to be a nightmare of corrosion engineering, because PDVSA has not performed basic maintenance on their midstream infrastructure in a decade, meaning the internal cladding of the pipelines is likely pitted by sulfuric acid corrosion, and the valves are seized by sedimentation. We are looking at a capex requirement of $50 billion just to replace the rusted carbon steel before we can even think about ramping production, which means the global oil markets are about to experience a phantom supply shock, where the oil is theoretically under U.S. control but physically stuck in the ground due to fluid dynamics and frictional pressure loss in degraded pipe networks. This brings us to the logistics of the extraction operation itself, which was a demonstration of kinetic supply chain dominance, where the failure of the Russian S-300VM air defense system wasn't just a tactical win, it was a material science failure for Moscow. Solid fuel rocket motors degrade over time. The chemical stabilizers break down, causing microfractures in the propellant grain. And without the precise climatic controlled storage that the Venezuelan military likely failed to provide, those missiles were likely ballistically unstable before they even fired. The U.S. jamming of their radar frequencies was an exercise in spectral dominance, effectively flooding the signal-to-noise ratio of the receiver arrays, until the Russian hardware could not distinguish a B-21 radar from background cosmic radiation. Now pivot north to the Arctic, because the ultimatum for Greenland is driven by the stoichiometry of the periodic table, specifically the lanthanide series. The F-35 fighter jets and the Virginia-class submarines that enforce U.S. hegemony are structurally dependent on neodymium for permanent magnets in actuators and dysprosium for high-temperature heat resistance in drive motors. Currently, the refining of rare earth elements involves an incredibly toxic solvent extraction process using acid baths that generate radioactive thorium as a byproduct, a process the U.S. EPA effectively regulated out of existence domestically, leaving China with a monopoly on the dirty work. Buying Greenland is not about real estate. It is about securing the raw ore body of the Kvanefjeld deposit so the U.S. can build a vertically integrated mine-to-magnet supply chain that bypasses the Chinese separation facilities. The logistical footprint of Thule Air Base will have to triple, requiring a fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers to keep the shipping lanes open year-round, because you cannot run a just-in-time manufacturing process for guidance chips if your raw materials are ice-bound for 6 months of the year. This connects directly to the fracture in the Arabian Peninsula, which is purely a question of pipeline throughput versus maritime choke points. The Saudis are pivoting away from the UAE because they are terrified of the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow 21-mile wide bottleneck where a single sunken supertanker could block 30% of the world's seaborne oil trade. Riyadh is trying to industrialize the Al-Mahra province in Yemen to build a massive pipeline capacity directly to the Indian Ocean, bypassing the Iranian kill zone entirely, but pumping crude over the mountainous terrain of Yemen requires massive pumping stations and reliable electrical grid stability, which simply does not exist. The UAE's interference in the south was threatening the right-of-way for this critical infrastructure, so the Saudis utilized kinetic leverage to clear the construction path. Meanwhile, the so-called normalization of the Red Sea shipping route is a statistical lie because the insurance actuarial tables have not normalized. A container ship burning 150 tons of heavy fuel oil per day, taking the Cape of Good Hope route, adds 2 weeks and $1 million in bunker fuel costs to the voyage, but sailing through the Bab el-Mandeb now requires war risk insurance premiums that have spiked 233%. This destroys the margins for low-value distinct commodities, meaning we are looking at a bifurcated logistics chain where high-value electronics fly air freight or take the fast, dangerous route, while bulk grains and raw materials take the slow route, creating an asynchronous inventory cycle that will wreak havoc on factory production schedules that rely on synchronized deliveries. If a factory in Ohio is waiting for a gear assembly from Shenzhen and a raw casting from Mumbai, and one comes via the Suez and the other via the Cape, the assembly line stops and overhead costs eat the profit margin. This is the industrial consequence of the weaponized dollar, which forces nations to settle trade in physical gold or barter, increasing the transactional friction of every single purchase. Settlement in gold requires physical vaulting, assaying, and armored transport, which is infinitely slower than a swift digital ledger entry. We are effectively deglobalizing the speed of money, returning to a velocity of capital determined by how fast a plane can fly a pallet of bullion rather than the speed of light through a fiber optic cable. The coalition of the willing in Europe is the final gear in this grinding machine, effectively a restructuring of the NATO supply chain, where the UK and France are acknowledging that they cannot wait for the US logistics tail to wag the dog. They are forward deploying maintenance and sustainment hubs into Ukraine, shifting from a strategy of donation to a strategy of industrial co-production, because the barrel wear on artillery pieces and the burn rate of 155 mm shells has outstripped the production capacity of the entire Western alliance. The events of January 2026 are not a political thriller. They are a series of forced corrections in the global industrial plant, fixing the inefficiencies of a supply chain that was overextended, underprotected, and reliant on the false assumption that free trade would always trump the physics of raw power